So with all that, thank you for coming to the Brownback seminar, jointly hosted by Delta Science Program, Ecosystem Restoration Program, and Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. Today we have Dr. John Wolfe from LimnoTech, which he's based in the close to LA. I don't want to pronounce the name wrong or the location name wrong. He's an environmental engineer and regional manager for the LimnoTech of the Southern California office. And he's one of the vice presidents of the company, and his primary expertise is in the fate and transport of toxics in aquatic environments, which is closely related to the system that we have in the Delta. He has a master's degree in environmental and water resources engineering from the University of Michigan, but before that, he has a PhD in economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has actually worked as professor in economics in Michigan State. I don't know why he did that. He's been an environmental consultant since 1993, has managed several projects evaluating and developing models of sediment and contaminant transport using geostatistical tools to support site characterization and remediation at sediment sites and characterizing and remediating groundwater contamination. So he's going to talk about his experience in using integrated ecosystem modeling to be used for the adaptive management practices. And he had worked on this Great Lakes project. Recent issue has been sort of a reemergence of algae blooms, which he has to sort of modify the design and then how to manage the lake system. So hopefully his information that he's going to give us today will be helpful for us to understand and manage the Delta ecosystem. So, John?
Okay, thanks very much, Hua-Xiang. And welcome, everyone. I appreciate the great turnout. The origin of this talk really was one that Joe DePinto gave at the QEMF meetings a couple of years ago. And then I gave a talk at the Delta Science Conference last October, which is really a short version of this talk, and was invited to come back and speak to this group. So it's a pleasure to be here and meet all of you. I've borrowed heavily material from John Bratton and Tad Slowecki. John also gave a version of the talk at the Integrated Modeling Workshop that was last May. So I wanted to give them credit. So I do want to make sure I still have control. There we go. Okay, so it's a modeling talk, but it's really not just a modeling talk. I mean, I want to talk about integrated modeling, integrating across media, across time and space with models, but also integrating the players, the stakeholders and the modelers, and integration and how that benefits decision making. And show some kind of good news stories from the Great Lakes, how it's been done, how integrated models have been used by integrated groups of decision makers to make progress in situations that are really just as challenging as what's faced in the Bay Delta, with as many players and as many problems and plans that were in place and did some things right but didn't do other things as well, and how models have been used to adapt them and kind of set a new path forward. Just some lists here of processes that are important in the Bay Delta to talk about integration. The complex processes of climate and flows through complex systems and physical impacts on the system, moving sediments around, and chemical impacts, especially salinity gets a lot of attention here, invasives and how they affect outcomes, and ultimately what we all care about most, ecosystem impacts as a dual goal with water supply. It's a real challenge here, having multiple actors with multiple models and multiple goals and how to get them all together. And one of the biggest challenges is uncertainty, that even if we have models, we don't know that they're exactly right. We need to make decisions anyway, monitor the outcomes, and then somehow be prepared to change. So I want to talk about a couple of case studies where this has come up in the Great Lakes. And one of them is the reoccurrence of harmful algal blooms and nuisance benthic algae. So what got the most attention, I believe this was last year, that the city of Toledo had to shut off its water supply, that it was choked with toxic blue-green algae with microcystis. And there were models in place and limits in place for phosphorus in the Great Lakes for 25 years that said that shouldn't have happened. So the technical people and the decision makers had to go back to the drawing board. The other case study I want to talk about is about operational controls, water level controls and their limitations. You know, another concern here with a much more complex system of controls. But so here's a profile of the Great Lakes, with Lake Superior being the most upstream, and Lakes Huron and Michigan sharing a water level just downstream, and Lake Erie, and really not very many water level controls, right? There are locks on the St. Mary's River, indicated here in black, and then there are locks here in the St. Lawrence Seaway and a dam to control Lake Ontario. But we see both sides of water level issues in the Great Lakes. In Lakes Michigan and Huron, where people have vacation homes, recreational boating, there's been not enough control over water levels. Climate's a big part of it, drier years, less ice cover in the winter, more evaporation. So in this graphic from NOAA, there's a record low lake level here shown in 2013. It's 2 or 3 feet lower than average. And here's a dock that can't be used because the water level's not well enough controlled. The flip side of that, in Lake Ontario, where water levels can be carefully controlled by the dam at the outlet to the lake, the initiation of water level controls in 1962, when the Seaway was built, led to a flattening out of water levels. You can see in the past before that, they'd cycled up and down, and a lot of the elements of the ecosystem really needed that. And so the photograph on the left shows the shores of Lake Ontario choked by cattails that thrive when the water level's steady. And it's good for cattails, but not so good for a lot of other species that need water level fluctuations. So that'll be the second case study. But first I wanted to set some context for the Great Lakes and talk about decision making. Well, so there are about 40 million people living in the Great Lakes Basin in the U.S. and Canada. There are 8 states and 2 provinces that border on the Great Lakes. And that's about the same population as California. So things are happening on roughly the same scale as here. And there are just as many interests to balance and promote in the Great Lakes as there are in the Central Valley of California, balancing water supply, water quality, recreation, commercial fisheries, navigation in the lakes, and the health of the ecosystem. And there are trade-offs among all those objectives. And one thing folks have learned in the Great Lakes, even though there are all those parties that need to agree on these competing objectives, is that their governments are most responsive when stakeholders can reconcile these competing interests, kind of work in advance among themselves, come to some agreements and put them to the governments to consider and approve. So there are lots of organizations in the Great Lakes that have formed to try to kind of reach pre-agreements. The International Joint Commission among the states and provinces, the Great Lakes Commission has a lot of participation of navigational and industry interests. Healing Our Waters is a group of NGOs. Great Lakes Industries have their own council. Mayors, governors, tribes, and delegation from the Great Lakes states in House and Senate all have organizations to try to help reach agreements. And as a result, there are lots of multi-party agreements in place. I won't go through all of them, but some of the important ones, you know, I'll be talking in my second case study about trying to control eutrophication. And it's really the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that was an agreement between the U.S. and Canada in '72 that's got several annexes that focus on nutrients and eutrophication. That's really the driver in restoring that part of the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Compact from 2008 is important. It's the agreement between the states and provinces to try to prevent other regions from taking the water, essentially, without violating the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So it's based on ecosystem sustainability. And the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, an executive order of the President that gets a lot of agencies together to clean up harbors that are contaminated with toxics. So one tool that the parties have developed over the years is this annual federal priorities sheet. And it's kind of doing Congress's homework for it in advance. You can see this online for 2015. It's a program that's endorsed by the states and provinces, industries, mayors, tribes, Chamber of Commerce, and Fisheries Commission. So they have competing interests, but they're all behind this kind of core program, and you can see the priorities that are listed for 2015. So they're, as we all are, they're looking for funding to get those things accomplished. So yeah, I wanted to start out with the decision-making context. I want to pay attention to data too, even though I'm going to get into modeling, because there is no modeling and decision-making without data, without good data, shared data, accessible data. And the Great Lakes have gotten their act together on data accessibility and management too. That the Great Lakes Observing System, called GLOS, back in the Great Lakes area, is a clearinghouse for data combining providers and users, and you know, it's an organization you can join. You join, you pay dues. Your dues are scaled to the kind of organization you are and your size. So they're governments, universities, NGOs, private industries, individuals. It's a binational nonprofit. It's one of 11 regional associations in IOS, the Integrated Ocean Observing System. So you go online, you can see a map of these all around North America. This is the one that's a freshwater data center, and it's the one that's binational. So its mission is to link users and providers of data, information and knowledge in a way that supports sound decision-making, something that I know there's a yearning for in California to make things work better. And its focuses are on ecosystem health, public health and water security, maritime operations, which are important in the Great Lakes, and climate change and natural hazards. So here's what we had before GLOS came along. It's hard to read the legend, but this is each color basically is a different observation system for kind of real-time data monitoring that existed in 2005 before the architecture for GLOS was developed. And you'd have to go to each one separately, really, to do analysis, pull all the data together any way that you could. The concept here is to go from observations on the left from a variety of providers, satellites, aircraft, ships, fixed platforms, buoys, and route that information to all the users that are shown in red boxes on the right here, people who want to close beaches when they're dangerous, manage water quality, manage navigation, search and rescue, fisheries management. Not all environmental water quality modelers, but it's good for us that these data are all in one place. And the heart of it is the data management system, data management and communication system. So here's another diagram of it. The blue objects here are really pre-existing entities, user communities on the left, whose needs are taken into account by the management system, and data providers on the right doing either research and development or operating data management systems. And GLOS is really the nerve center of the whole thing, managing and enabling communications, managed by a board of members with highly interactive among all the players. And so I have a few screenshots of what the portal looks like online. So here's a metadata catalog, basically a place that you can get in and click on a type of data that you want to see and start finding it on a map. One thing that you might want to see is where all the installations are for doing telemetry on fish, sensors that can see when tagged fish swim by. And so this is from GLOS, a map of where all those locations are, and you can click on a dot and start looking at data that had been collected there. I think this is a map of all the temperature stations in the Great Lakes, and again, you could click on the map there and pull up a temperature plot. And this is a specialty data portal for looking at harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie, which will be my second case study. So it's got a lot of capability. The whole point of GLOS was to leverage all the efforts that were already taking place and make the data accessible in a form that you could trust and accessible to the whole community of users. Okay, so I've talked about the decision-making context and about data collection efforts that are going on in the Great Lakes. Now let me talk about two modeling efforts, and these are really two case studies of control programs that were in place, worked reasonably well, but were found to need adjustment, and how models were used to bring the stakeholders together to make those adjustments. And so the first one is about Lake Ontario, and that's where the number 1 is in this map, this view from space of the Great Lakes. And the second is about harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. So some background on, let me go right to the map. Here's a map of Lake Ontario. It drains out the St. Lawrence River. Until the 50s, it was uncontrolled, but it was dammed and locks were built and bigger ships could get into the Great Lakes via the St. Lawrence Seaway. And one side effect was controlling the water level in Lake Ontario and the upper St. Lawrence with the Moses-Saunders Dam, according to a plan that was put together in 1958. The regulations that were promulgated in those days set a plan for targeting weekly water levels and flows, and the objectives when they built the seaway were to serve hydropower, commercial navigation through the locks, and water supply and prevent floods. So they weren't thinking much about ecosystem health. And since 1958, interests have evolved. More interested in environmental preservation, more recreational boating on Lake Ontario, and altogether different priorities among the riparian landowners. So a kind of process of shared vision planning was initiated by the IJC, by the states and provinces in 2000. And I'm going to focus most on the ecological part of it because that's the part that we worked on. Looking at economic interests, navigation interests, safety interests was also part of what was traded off by decision makers. So our role was to create a model of ecosystem outcomes that would vary depending on how the controls at the dam and the lake level were controlled. If you allowed lake levels to vary more seasonally in such a way that would be consistent with breeding patterns and habitation by wildlife, what would be the benefits and what would be an optimal plan? So this is a conceptual model. It's kind of hard to read this graphic, but let's say here we've got multiple fish species that were of concern, and the timing of their spawning is going to depend on water temperature, and it's going to depend on water levels, their access to wetlands, and also the existence and growth of wetlands. So taking that example, you know, what this model does is it takes weather, it takes years and years of past precipitation history, and first of all, applies the 1958 plan and translates that into a water level series, and then looks at each species to see how it would fare. So that sets the baseline. To do that, subject area experts, ecological scientists specializing in each one of these species, for example, experts on muskrats and their need for cattails would have been involved in developing that module. But you can imagine meteorology feeding into rules for water level controls, feeding into a status, either an improved or degraded status for each species. And it was done by an iterative process. So starting point here was the existing plan for water level controls. The plan was applied to rainfall series to get a time series of water levels simulated over decades, computed basically the status of each species over those decades, and then evaluated, you know, where the biggest problems were, looked at possibilities of improvement, and tried out a new plan. Let's say we'd identified that the least bittern was the species in the most trouble. Then a plan was developed that would better encourage its breeding, and fed again through the water level. And in making these changes, it was really a combination of judgments by technical people and non-technical people to decide how to improve things. This is a bullseye diagram that was used to assess progress. Each one of the dots represents a species. So there's one labeled here, the least bittern. Doing better than the existing plan gets you within the red circle. Basically, each dot here represents a comparison between the status of the species under the existing 1958 plan and the plan that was being tried out. So you can see this one is pretty good. Almost all the species have their status improved if everything's normalized. So if your status was twice as good as under the existing plan, you'd be at the brown dot. And if it was worse, basically, you'd be out here at the black circle. And so the breeding success of the least bittern is shown here in red in the lower right-hand panel, and you can see it's consistently higher because of the way water levels are being controlled. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the kind of institutional setup of this planning process, too. You know, there was a study board of non-technical professionals who went through this process of sitting down with the modelers and looking at the output and saying, that's not good enough. What can you do to foster this species or this interest? And they had a kind of a process of would-be recommendations, would-be decision-making. Like, given what we see right now, if you had to make a decision, what would you do based on the modeling that exists now? And it allowed them to learn about the research. You know, what this process was trying to avoid was dumping a report on their desk at the end and saying, read this and decide what you want to do. Instead, they worked through it with the modelers iteratively and considered the results in a decision context and could play a role in deciding, you know, what are the unknowns that we need to know more about, or what did we think was important that actually is emerging as not very important? What are the red herrings that we can ignore? And so participants could form their opinions slowly, build more confidence and understanding in their ability to make decisions. So in that way, it bridged the gap between technical people and stakeholders and decision makers. The outcome is Plan 2014. So a particular revised plan for controlling lake levels in Lake Ontario. It was approved by the IJC last year, supported by a broad coalition of stakeholders. The Nature Conservancy is strongly behind it. And it's now under review, basically, by the two federal governments, the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Canada. But hopefully they'll approve it, and it'll be a process that worked. And I want to talk about adaptive management, too. I had that in the title of my talk, and I want to hit it on each one of these. There's an explicit plan for adaptive management in Plan 2014. First step is to identify areas of uncertainty in the modeling. And one of those is future water supplies. You know, that depends on future climate. How much is it going to rain in Lake Ontario? How much water is there to work with to retain in the lake or let out of the dam? And the other major area of uncertainty that was identified was the ecological impacts. You know, how accurate were each one of those models of species status relating it to water levels? It was the best knowledge that we had, but such models are uncertain. And so part of the plan moving forward, even if the consensus plan is accepted, is to monitor indicators related to water supply and to ecological impacts and compare to the models and see how well the model did. Change the models if necessary and be prepared to change decisions if warranted. So lessons learned from the Lake Ontario case study. Ecological impacts can be integrated into system-wide models of flow and water level. That's one of the big challenges here, to integrate them all, have them run as an integrated whole. And to do that, modelers need to work closely with biologists, not to think of models that are something that are just about flow. They're really about ecosystem impacts. And consensus management, you know, it's no easier there than here. There are a lot of people who want a lot of different things. And it works best with an iterative process in consultation with stakeholders and not something that modelers just drop on decision makers. And finally, for adaptive management, we need to maintain these models. I mean, they need to be in place. We need to keep collecting data on ecosystem impacts and have the models ready if they need to be modified in the future to adjust those decisions. Okay, the second case study is about eutrophication modeling in the Great Lakes. This is really a case of two-stage adaptive management. This is a problem that was solved, really, in the 1980s and reemerged. That phosphorus targets were set in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 1978, and they seemed to work fine for about 25 years. And then starting in about 2010, the nuisance algae blooms reemerged and got out of control, even though we were still hitting the phosphorus targets. So what was done to adapt and what will be done to adapt in the future? Here's a schematic of Lake Erie. It's really got 3 basins and 3 distinct problems. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes. The western basin is really shallow, and that's where the toxic algal blooms appear. There's Toledo at the west end of Lake Erie. The central basin of Lake Erie, where Toledo is located, is where the most serious hypoxia occurs because of its depth. So when the lake stratifies in the late summer, oxygen disappears in the lower lake. And in the eastern basin, where Buffalo is located, nearshore benthic algae form, foul the beaches. So these were all really serious problems in the late 60s and 70s. And so modelers were brought in to try to diagnose them and solve them. And an ensemble approach of models was put together. And these are a few shots from one of them. This is the DeToro model of phosphorus and nitrogen and its effects on dissolved oxygen. So the left-hand column of model outputs here is in 1970, matching the plunging of dissolved oxygen in the central basin of Lake Erie in August of 1970. And then the model was verified in 1975 to show it also did a good job simulating DO sags in 75. And there's some other plots here showing it did a decent job of explaining why, simulating concentrations of nitrogen, phosphorus, and chlorophyll. The outcome was a phosphorus load response curve to try to solve this problem of anoxic area in the central basin. And so these curves that come out of the DeToro model show the more phosphorus, the more area was anoxic. And it appeared that if you could reduce the whole lake phosphorus load to between 10 and 12,000 metric tons per year, that anoxia would disappear. And so that's the target that was adopted and agreed to by the states and provinces. And this was primarily urban loads at that time, loads of nutrients from wastewater treatment plants, people using phosphorus detergents. You know, cutting the load in Detroit at its wastewater treatment plant was really important for solving this problem. And so phosphorus loads were reduced. In those days, it was sufficient to cut point source loads, you know, through NPDES permits. And so a lot was spent on wastewater treatment in the Great Lakes, $8.8 billion between 1972 and 1985. The annual load of phosphorus did come down to below 11,000 metric tons per year in almost every year, not in the wettest weather years, but typically was below 11,000 metric tons per year. And this problem was considered to be solved. The anoxic zone really did disappear. And then it recurred. Here's a satellite image from 2011 of blue-green algae in the western basin. And so the IJC set about to try to figure why and pulled in modelers and data gatherers to try to solve the problem. All 3 problems recurred: toxic algal blooms in the western basin, hypoxia in the central basin, and Phaedophora in the eastern basin. So what changed? Why weren't the nutrient reductions sufficient? One thing that changed is invasive mussels. The bottoms of the Great Lakes are just coated with zebra mussels and quagga mussels, mussels that came in via the St. Lawrence Seaway I talked about a few minutes ago. When all those ships came in starting in 1958 and dumped their ballast in the Great Lakes, they brought these invasive mussels from the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and they've been filtering the water column ever since. They filter out a lot of algae and allow light penetration, but they don't like blue-green algae. So they allow blue-green algae to really thrive. And also the nature of phosphorus loads has changed, in part because of changes in weather, that it's wetter in the spring, and so the nutrient loads are more weather dependent. And phosphorus is now in a more bioavailable form, too, that of the total that's getting to the Great Lakes of those 11,000 metric tons, much more of it is in the form of soluble reactive phosphorus. And there's a graphic of that. Since about 1995, the trend has been, a doubling of soluble reactive phosphorus. It's not completely understood why that is. There's more no-till farming of corn and soybeans in the Lake Erie Basin. There's more there's more winter fertilization of fields for corn and soybeans, so it's sitting there in the spring when the rains come. There's more double application in the winter, kind of every other year. At any rate, there's more of it. It's more available to algae, so the same number for total phosphorus is no longer sufficient to eliminate toxic algal blooms. And so a subcommittee under the Nutrients Annex of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has gotten together and proposed new targets, lower targets, to restore compliance with these objectives that are codified in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. To maintain cyanobacteria below toxic levels in the Western Basin, to minimize hypoxic zones in the Central Basin, and to maintain algae below nuisance levels in the Eastern Basin. And so there's a new ensemble of models that's been pulled together, the best of the existing models, and they range from statistical models, the Stumpf model at the top there is a statistical model, to detailed numerical models that are more integrative. And I want to talk about one of those, one that my colleague Joe DePinto led, the Western Lake Erie ecosystem model that was built to try to understand and find solutions to toxic algal blooms in Western Lake Erie. So the Western Lake Erie ecosystem model, I'll show two graphics of what's in it. And this graphic is really about flows and solids. There's a hydrodynamic model that relates flows into the lake from the Detroit River that's up top here. So this is where most of the flow from the Great Lakes comes in. This is feeding in from Lake Huron. And the Maumee River on the left, this is where most of the nutrients come from. The Maumee is a big agricultural watershed. The nutrient concentrations are much higher in the Maumee River than the Detroit River. And they move with solids in large part. So the movement of solids suspended in the river flow and kicked up by wind waves is very important for understanding the movement of nutrients. And then there's a linkage to nutrient and eutrophication submodel. And I want to make another pitch for biological models here too, that we don't just feed outputs from flow and sediment transport models to spreadsheet models for biologists, but biological models have to be really integrated into these flow and sediment models to be able to iteratively look at solutions, to not just look at it once, but look at it over and over and over again. So the biological part of the Western Lake Erie ecological model has these components. It's ultimately all about phytoplankton growth and cladophora growth But to get there, you have to understand the cycling of nutrients and solids, the loads that are coming in externally, how they're filtered by invasive clams, and how they move in and out of the sediment bed, depending on oxic and anoxic conditions. So let me show a few calibration plots from the Western Lake Erie model, since this is a modeling talk. Here are 3 stations that were used to check the calibration of the phosphorus model. And the station that's closest to the Maumee River has the highest predicted and actual phosphorus concentrations. The red dots are actual data over 3 years, and the model did a pretty good job of fitting them. The second box is a little further from the outlet of the Maumee River, and the nutrients are more diluted. And the model does a good job of hitting those targets partway out and further out into Lake Erie. And then ultimately, this model is trying to predict microcystis blooms. So here's how it did predicting microcystis biovolume, averaged over 4 stations from 2008 to 2014. So again, accurate enough to use for decision support. With the Ditoro model, I showed you a load response curve for phosphorus and related it to hypoxia in the Central Basin. So here's a load response curve that was developed for the Western Lake Erie ecosystem model. On the horizontal axis, we've got the Maumee River total phosphorus load. And on the vertical axis, the biomass of cyanobacteria in Western Lake Erie. And the blue curve here is the relationship between Maumee River loads and cyanobacteria biomass. So the problem is that we're trying to get biomass below this green line, that this represents a level that was considered not severe in 2004 and 2012. And we've got a baseline year here, 2008, that actually met the existing phosphorus loads, and yet cyanobacteria were above the nuisance level. So what would it take to bring them down? And so this shows the effect of a 40% reduction in total phosphorus loads from the Maumee River. Moving to the left because the load's gone down, and coming down because the biomass is reduced. And the point is it takes it below this critical line to a level that was consistent with years that didn't have problems. So this is really the heart of how the models were used to help support decisions. That the model tells you if you could reduce these Maumee River loads by 40%, the nuisance algal blooms would go away. It's not an easy thing to do. It was easier to get people to stop using detergent and to have secondary treatment at wastewater treatment plants than to reduce these loads, but this is what it would take. And so this is a detailed graphic from the modeler's report, but you can see the number 40% there in a number of places. The 40% reduction of total phosphorus entering the lake was the target for reducing hypoxia, and 40% reductions from all of these tributaries that are bringing in agricultural loads is the target for reducing nuisance algal blooms. And I'll say that right now it's a recommended plan. That the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement called for a recommendation this year for an actual strategy to be enacted in 2 years and for measures to be in place 2 years after that. So the report is kind of on the desk of the states and provinces now to put together a strategy to figure out how to reduce these levels. There's also a plan for adaptive management that's part of the modeling report. And similar to what I talked about with Lake Ontario, the first step is to identify the uncertainties in the modeling that you've done. And the modelers felt that they couldn't really be sure, based on the data they had, what the mix of response was to particulate and dissolved phosphorus. So they'd like to know more about that. And whether nitrogen load reductions might help. Exactly quantitatively what the role was of invasives. How important climate change is in driving these blooms, and which watersheds are really causing the most problem. So the plan for adaptive management is to monitor all those things. Monitor nutrients and solids from the tributaries, monitor best management practices that are put into effect in ag lands and what the results are in nutrient concentrations in the lakes, and how all these problems respond. And to conduct research and keep developing models to try to understand those responses. So lessons learned from the Lake Erie experience. Behavior changes, weather changes too. Ecosystems evolve. It's all very complex. To understand all those interactions, you need integrated modeling. And models can inform adaptive management. As the states and provinces are trying to adapt right now to a problem that they didn't think would come back. Help to understand what's changed and help to set new targets. And to do that effectively, you really have to, it's really best, to try to identify the uncertainties in your modeling and track them. Monitor loads, monitor outcomes, and maintain, don't just put those models on the shelf, but maintain and improve them to reflect what you learn from the monitoring. So a few thoughts about the Bay Delta, the challenges here. Modeling's necessarily been fragmented in different time and space scales to look at different problems and different issues. Water supply versus ecosystem impacts. And the models are big and complicated. It's really challenging to iterate through alternative scenarios over and over and over again with models that take a long time to run with the existing suites of models. And I'll add, too, that I think it's conceptually challenging to model operations as part of that iterative process. That CalSim2, the model that we use here to model operations and water supply, explicitly incorporates a set of contemporary priorities, and to some extent they can be modified within that model. It assumes a certain contemporary water demand or a different water demand, but the big question is, how will those priorities and how will water demand change in response to climate, in response to management performance, and how can you build that feedback really into an iterative modeling process in a way that's, that takes into account what your models tell you. In terms of fragmentation, there's also been excessive fragmentation of efforts among multiple players, state and federal agencies, local and regional governments, academics, NGOs, consultants, lots of parallel modeling efforts. It's good to have a lot of smart people looking at problems, and we benefit from that. And the ensemble modeling approach ultimately was helpful in the Great Lakes. I've listed some of the models I know about here that are integrative. There are a good number of them. But there'd be potential improvement, potential benefits of improved coordination. If there was more working together on these models, inefficiencies could be reduced and costs could be reduced for the players. There could be more information sharing. It might be easier to address issues up front and help parties reach consensus. And models that do different things, their linkage might help each other to solve each other's problems. And since the integrated modeling workshop in May, there's been a lot of buzz about thoughts of a community modeling hub, some kind of a shared repository of data and models that could set standards for software practice, something like GLOS does for data in the Great Lakes, but expanded to include models too. Providing a forum for comparison of model results and involving stakeholders up front in developing models that are oriented toward answering the most important stakeholder questions. My last slide, lessons learned. This process can work. Those problems identified in the Great Lakes aren't solved once and for all, but progress is being made on both. And in terms of modeling, it's important to integrate processes and have single models that are tractable and flexible and can look at all the alternatives. It's important to have the stakeholders engaged up front in exercising those models. And it's not going to take you exactly where you want to go, so it's important to keep up the monitoring and the model development and adapt. You make the best decisions you can, but you know it'll be best to adapt them at some point. Things will change and systems will evolve, and integrated data and models can help us understand those changes and help support decisions to revise those targets in the future. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Raise your hand, a microphone for you.
I was just curious about, because this is also an issue, is how do you get the funding for doing all this work? So especially with your Lake Ontario example and that study board that worked individually with the modelers, just if you could talk about where the funding came from.
Yeah, so it was a process that was done for the International Joint Commission, which has some funding from the states and provinces, and also with contributions from interested stakeholders, riparian interests and navigational interests.
I had the good fortune to work on the Great Lakes for 3 years in the late 80s, and one thing I thought different about the lakes and our system is it changed pretty slowly. I mean, hardware, the seaway on the Lake Ontario example, that was put in place in 1958, and it was still operating under an operating regime that was been stable for the resident time of water in the lake. 2 or 3 years. Slow, whereas our since 1958, with the addition of reservoirs, our operating regimes have changed quite a bit. Resident time in the LOSL, we have more change than 12 hours than most of the lakes would have over a decade. And so I wonder if use of models approach it works better there. Change isn't so dynamic. It's not so dynamic. There's a lot more stability. Is that a fundamental difference? Is it easier to apply models to resolve problems there?
Well, this system is operationally much more complex. And you talked about the changing hardware, and they're changing operations of that hardware too. I mean, there's hardly anything like that in the Great Lakes. Like you said, there's one dam built in 1958 that we have to think about different controls for. So I think that's a really big challenge in managing this system. the climate is certainly highly variable in the Great Lakes region, and the the processes that I was talking about are greatly affected by runoff, by spring rainfall. The very amount of water in the lakes is affected a lot by how hard the winter is, the length of ice cover, and the evaporation that happens when there are big differences in water temperature between the lake and the atmosphere. So I dare say that the variability of weather is probably more of a challenge there than in California with our sort of steady, benign seasons.
I was curious how you said that I think there were 8 states and 2 provinces, Canadian provinces. So, and then there was all these commissions and working groups and whatever. What was the catalyst that got all of those 8, the political catalyst that got all those 8 states and 2 provinces together? And it sounds like they work together pretty well. I mean, they're very effective in getting federal funding to help solve their problem, as well as their individual states and provinces contributing.
Well, I guess the ones I know best are the big drivers that had to be solved jointly. The eutrophication problem that I talked about, really neither nation alone could solve that. I alluded to an agreement in 2008 too about water diversions, and that's a big concern there. I mean, the fear in the Great Lakes is that somebody will build a pipe and send all the water south or west to dry areas. And the Constitution allows it. I mean, there are bottling plants in the Great Lakes that fill bottles like this and ship them out of the watershed. It's interstate commerce. So the states and provinces had to focus on what's really the driver here. Why don't we want this? And what could we all agree on to do about it? And ultimately, that was a system of ecological protections. I mean, making the connection between water levels and ecosystem health, and saying you can take out just so much water so that you don't harm ecosystems. So bottling plants, if they don't draw down the water table too far, can do that. But anyway, that's a problem that had to be agreed on jointly, and it took a lot of negotiation to find a protocol that all the states and provinces could agree on. So that's a big driver. I'd say the problems, really, the problems that had to be solved jointly are the driver for that process. And within a U.S. context, the fact that there's so many states, too, that, they wanted to be able to compete successfully with the Chesapeake Bay and the Everglades and the Bay Delta, areas that are also looking for federal money. And so it's been important to get together and speak with one voice.
Was there a political entity that brought all these together and kept them negotiating? Was there a political entity that kept all those groups together and organized their negotiations? I'd
say there are a lot of political entities, really, all the ones that I listed. I don't know if there's one single driver.
Do you think that this thing, can you hear me? There you are. Do you think to adapt to large state changes that we might see here in the data on the time scale of it could be a year in terms of introduction of invasives or management changes like animals and such like that? Can models respond? Can they model the system adequately for remediation decisions years or even less than that?
Yeah, so the question is whether models have the ability to adapt to state changes. You mentioned invasives, and you mentioned tunnels, and to look at the impacts of those things. I think they do and they need to. I think they're currently limited in their ability to, their nimbleness to look at those things. I mean, I showed you a model that incorporates the effect of invasives. You can't really understand algal growth in the Great Lakes without including filtering of the water column by invasives. And so that can be done and should, and you have invasives in the downstream end that I think have exactly that effect on water quality. And also models really should be able to plug in infrastructure like the tunnels in fairly short order and show you what the ecosystem outcomes would be. And so it's a goal really to develop models that are not that nimble, that are built at the right time and space scale, that you can do decision support with them. But I think you asked the question because it's a challenge now, and I understand that it is.
Okay, that concludes the seminar. Please remember that next Wednesday we have another seminar on levee stability issues, so please join us for that. And then let's give another hand to Dr.
Okay, thanks for coming.